Okay, the topic for today is death. And more specifically, how we as Americans in particular use media as a means of saying goodbye to people, of retaining a memory of them, and we're going to talk about how that works in each of our lives. And the chapter that tacks on to the end of the chapter about memory and media with people who have died talks about fiction, specifically television fiction. It's written by Mark Pinsky, who is Jewish, but he has a lot of fond regards for evangelicals. He's actually been a guest speaker at conferences on evangelicals and media. I was at one with him at Calvin College up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and he just came out right and said, I don't believe what you guys believe. I'm Jewish by cultural tradition. I don't really practice Judaism. But he said, you evangelicals have some good stuff going on that I respect. So his chapter, I think, has insights that we can take from as evangelical believers. Okay, so media is a tool that we use to say goodbye. And I would suggest to you that we live in a culture that is so media saturated that there's a sense in which when somebody dies and we don't have a means of saying something about their passing, that we feel cheated. Now, there was a time in this country, as your book talks about, when death was much more personal to us. I wasn't going to get real intimate with this, but I think I can ask this question. How many of you have witnessed someone close to you or a family member die? You saw it, the person, you watched the person die. Raise your hand. Okay? Now, those of you who did see that, is there something about that memory that you commemorate in some way? Do you remember that day? Is the location where that happened something that is very special to you? Talk to me if you raise your hand. Randa? Wow. So every time you hear that song, depending, I mean, some days it probably doesn't hit you as often as others, but that song has special meaning. Let me tell you about two instances where music, it's interesting you mentioned music, how that stuck with me too. When I can't tell you how old I was, maybe 13, 12, we had a bad habit. I don't do this with my family, but my parents had a very bad habit of watching television while we were eating. It's because my dad's an engineer and he just doesn't like making small talk, and so we watch TV. So we were watching a movie with Debbie Reynolds, and I think the movie is called Tammy's in Love. Is that a very old movie? Probably you've never heard of it. You know what I'm talking about. So, and in that movie, she sings the song Tammy's in Love. While we were watching that movie, while she was singing that song, we got a phone call. And it was, I can't remember if my mom took it or my dad, but whoever got the call came back to the table and just told us, while we're eating dinner, that my father's uncle had shot his wife and then shot himself with a shotgun and they had just found the bodies in Freeport, Michigan, Freeport, Illinois, which was about 3 hours northwest of where we lived. And I will never forget that song playing in my mind, and I'm just thinking, Debbie Reynolds does not have this problem. I wish I could be in that movie right now. I don't want to be here, because it was just this darkness descended on our dinner table. And I had no escape. Where do I go from this? How could he do this? And there's a long history of alcohol abuse and just dysfunctional family, and in a lot of ways, it wasn't a surprising phenomenon that this guy would do this, but just horror that this could happen. So that song, that movie sticks in my mind. The other one is when my grandfather died. And at his funeral, my cousin sang a duet with her husband. And I will never forget the way she sang. I don't know if you've ever heard somebody that, they're a pretty good singer, but she nailed it. I mean, she sounded like a professional singer up there. And I thought, how can she do that? Isn't that hard? But when you're in that moment, she was singing and saying goodbye to my grandfather. And she said, since that time, she's never really sung that way again. In that same way, it was that moment. So something about when people leave this life, media helps us to deal with that. And it can be as simple as a roadside cross, which we'll talk about in a minute. But saying goodbye is important, it's huge. Missing in action is worse than the casket coming home. Because missing in action means you never know, you don't have closure. Where are they? You don't know. So, the question all of us face is, why do people have to die? I was really close to my grandparents, and I remember as a kid watching them age and just thinking, why do people have to get old? Can't they stay young? Can't they stick around? Don't go. Don't leave me. Why is that? Well, from Scripture we know that there's a very definitive reason for that. Genesis 3, God said there has to be death. Has to be. You remember the garden? Adam and Eve both disobeyed God by eating from the tree of life. Then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now, lest he stretch out his hand and take from the tree of life and live forever in this depraved state, God said, I'm going to put a statute of limitations on everybody. Everyone will leave this life physically. That's the reason. If people come to you and say, why do people have to die? That's not the moment to get theological with them. What you want to do is just hold them and say, I don't even have words. I'm here. I'm here for you. I'm with you. If you want to talk, that's what you do. But the answer really is, you don't want the alternative, and that is eternal life in damnation. So, is death a cause for despair? And the answer is no. Evangelicals rejoice at their funerals. It is an incredible thing. In New Orleans, this isn't necessarily people who know Christ doing this, but they dance to the cemetery. There's a brass band playing, and they're just, it's this, that's how Christians can talk about death. 1 Corinthians 15:22 says, "For since by a man came death, by a man came also the resurrection from the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all shall be made alive." The last enemy to be abolished is death. God said, right at that moment, when he said, you have to leave the garden, he said, I'm taking care of this. Death is not going to win. Death will lose. And we know the end of the book about that. Later in that chapter, I love 1 Corinthians 15. But when this perishable will have put on the imperishable, then will come about the saying that's written, death is swallowed up in victory. You can stand at the graveside of a person that knew Jesus Christ and served him, and you can say, I will see you very soon. We don't have despair. God has hope for us, even as people leave us. Doesn't make it easier. What is going on in Japan right now is absolutely unfathomable for us as Americans. No one who hasn't lived on an archipelago in the Pacific Ocean knows what it's like to be vulnerable to the sea and to the power of technology. What's happening to the 2 reactors that are melting down as we speak has put this entire developed world on notice to say nuclear power has flaws, huge flaws. And we've been living in denial about the fact that this is a monster that we think we've tamed, and we have not. So this is what it looks like. This guy just found out that a friend of his is gone. The grief is real. And so we as believers know that when someone looks like this, sometimes what you do in that moment is you ask them, is there something that I can do to help you remember that person? And when I teach, those of you who aren't journalism majors probably have heard this horrific statement that unthinking journalists occasionally do. They'll take a microphone, whether it's for print journalism or broadcast, they'll stick it in somebody's face who looks like that and say, how does it feel? How does it feel? Well, take a picture. That's how it feels. Wrong question. Wrong question. A better question is this. You have lost someone that was knit to your soul. Tell me their story. Tell me about their life. Help me celebrate that person. That is healing. Because if they believe you, they'll sit down with you and they'll say, you know what, I trust you. You're not going to do an injustice to me with this person's story. I'm going to tell you their story. Because it's amazing, and this person had a life that nobody's going to believe, and it's over, and I hate that. But yes, let me tell you their story. There's healing. There's healing in telling that person's story. I want to know about that guy's friend. So, part of the healing and grief over death does come in the media that we create. Narrative that tells their story. Whether it's factual or whether it's poetry. Maybe it's song lyrics that just tell the story of this person. Maybe it's a short story. Maybe it's a film. narrative that commemorates them. How about this? Displays of their work. There's a passage in the New Testament where one of the apostles, I can't remember if it's Peter or Paul, is called in and someone's died. Her name was Tabitha, which is Greek for gazelle. Just think about that. Just a woman, everybody loved her, and she was a craftsperson. She made clothing. And so when they brought in the apostle to what they wanted was healing, but they just said, this person's died, and they're showing her her clothing that she made. Look what she made. She made this and this. That was part of their grief. Photos or video. When we lived in Kentucky, my kids had a babysitter who lived across the street. And she was probably in early teens. And we got the word one afternoon, right before the kids came home from school, that she died. Turns out she had been born with a heart that never grew to the capacity of her body. And so the doctors told her, parents, it's just a matter of time. She's got a heart that's this big. And she's getting bigger. And her parents said, don't tell her. We want her to enjoy her life. So one day, it was middle of winter, she said, Mom and Dad, I'm going to go sledding with my friends. They said, okay, every day they lived with, is she coming home today? She said, can I? They said, your friends? Yeah, go be with your friends. So she was running up this hill to do another run down the sled hill, and she dropped. Her heart burst. And her parents just had this sense that she's here. She's in God's hand. We can't hold her. When it's God's time, He will take her. That day He did. And so at the funeral home, I remember it was an open casket. I have a hard time with that, but there's something about open caskets that do give closure, don't they? We're saying goodbye. If you don't see the body, something about, anyway, the other side of this, I don't want to see, because that's not really the person. They're gone. It's like a glove with no hand in it. You know, why do I want to see that? But anyway, so at the funeral home, they had a table covered with snapshots. Her entire life, this big, covered with snapshots. And before you could get into the room where the casket was, you had to walk by this table. And people were just lined up, stopped, line out the door down the block, because they wanted to see these pictures, remembering her life. Those pictures are just crucial. Video does the same thing. It's like, I can hear that voice again. I can see how she moved, how she laughed. We talked about music. Special edition art displays that just celebrate this person's spirit. Music, documentaries, feature films. All this stuff we create, I would suggest to you, is really about us, because it doesn't help them. But it sure helps us, doesn't it? There's something about that media that's just so rich. Now, let's talk about obituaries, because your book goes into some detail about this. And so be sure to read the chapter and look at this, because it's really important. These are highlights from the chapter. So for the quiz, just put you on notice, I will give you some study notes for the next quiz. But here's a heads up, do know this stuff. 19th century obits were different than obits today. What's an obituary? An obituary is the story of a person who has died. In my introductory journalism class, what I had the students do partway through the semester is write their own obituary. Totally freaks them out. But it's so valuable. What was my life? Can I put it into 5 paragraphs? This is what I want the world to remember me by. This narrative. It's not easy to do. My grandmother, on my mom's side, wrote her own obituary, put it in a safe deposit box at the bank, and said, use this, because I know the paper's going to mess it up. She had some journalism background, so she wrote this thing, you know, it had her own little spin on, you know, this is how it worked. I didn't get fired, I changed jobs, you know, the whole thing, you know. Very nice narrative about her life. And it ran. It ran in the paper on the day after she passed away. Coldwater, Michigan. So in the 19th century, obits were very detailed, and they mentioned God. Because in the 19th century, in this country, there was a common expectation that God is among us, and that people believed that God was there. So these obits listed the achievements, which we have today as well. They spoke of challenges, formative influences in a person's life, key relatives. And then oftentimes they described how the person died. The woman breathed her last in her bedroom, surrounded by her family. We don't do that today. 20th century obits look more like this. You can find them in detail, but only for famous people, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute from the New York Times. Most obits in most publications are diminished in size, very limited in life details. They frequently omit the cause of death because of the outside chance the person died of some cause that would bring shame upon the family. So you won't see references to AIDS or suicide or specific types of disease that are related to things like drinking. Cirrhosis of the liver, your chapter talks about. It's real hard to get that unless you drink a lot of alcohol. Possible, but that's one of those things you think, ooh, cirrhosis, wow, yeah, okay, that's really tragic. I'm sorry they died that way. So often left out completely. Sometimes your book mentions that to avoid problems of fabrication of obituaries, newspapers will only take funeral home notices. Not that they wouldn't fabricate, right? But that's one of the ways they do it. But what's happened increasingly is that newspapers have said, okay, if you want more space, you actually get 2 inches. That's all. If you want more, we will sell you. By the inch, column inch, more space. And so you'll see in the LA Times, there are long, with a picture of a person that was probably purchased, like classified space. Here's what it looks like in the LA Daily News. Probably can't see that too well, but it lists the name, age, when they were born, and tells about their life. On this website, they advertise plants that you can buy for the graveyard. Yeah. Sort of commodifying the whole thing. Okay, let me show you an example from the New York Times of something called the last word. And I would encourage you to go to this site because it's not just about old people. It's about people that maybe are younger but had relevance to American culture, American industry, American politics. And this person to me was very interesting. She's dead. But she's not. because you can hear her voice, and she's dialoguing, and it takes you back into her life, and this is a living memory. And there are actually projects out there funded by really big foundations that would pay you students to videotape people like that, or have them tell their story on an audio recording device to put it into an archive so we don't lose these amazing stories. There's people dying constantly who have this wealth of memory of stuff that we're all forgetting. And we are a nation, the United States, shame on us. We have a collective memory that is about one generation long. You go to other countries, and they remember their history going back thousands of years because they have an oral history, and they just learn it. You can't be in that country without hearing the history and the stories of that place. The U.S., I don't know, we're just not keeping track of who we are as a nation, and we're forgetting. It's tragic. So, telling the stories as people leave this life are important. So what is up with these roadside crosses? Well, they're kind of a problem. So in many states, they're illegal. You put up a roadside cross, cop sees you doing it, you'll get a citation. But they're placed by friends, by family members, and your book talks about the fact that they carry enormous symbolic powers. As a matter of fact, they are more evocative of memory of a person who's gone than the grave itself. Yes, that's a tombstone. Yes, it says that that person's body is down there. But when I drive by that cross at that hairpin curve where I know that's where it happened. They died right there. That's different. That's powerful. Okay? So there is something actually so powerful about that the police say that that's a distraction that could actually cause accidents. So anybody would, it's a cross. We can't have that. That's like establishment of religion. First Amendment says don't do that. Of course, you remember I told you about that, right? Other side of the coin says there's something called free exercise, which is in the First Amendment. Nonetheless, it's outlawed by many cities and states. They will remove them. They'll take them off. But as your book says, it kind of depends on the city, on the state, on the region. Sometimes they'll just do this. They'll just leave it. Just leave it. Let him put it up. Now the 6-foot cross that we saw in the book, that's a little big. But just if it's a little memorial, looks like this, that's okay. Okay, true confessions time. How many of you have either placed, I'm not going to tell, have you placed one of these or you know someone who has? Raise your hand. Okay, where? Randa? Where?
In the Bay Area.
So, right here in California. Okay, Kimmy?
On the street where their daughter was killed.
Okay. Is it still there, or is you just know it was put there, but it's gone now?
It's gone now.
It's gone.
I'm not sure.
You haven't been there in a while. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. So, what do you think about that? That it was there. Was that a good thing? Was it powerful? What were your thoughts about that? I tell you, there's public places can suddenly become so intimate and personal when somebody you know either died or was even injured in that place. Back when I was in Kentucky, my grandparents came to visit me. My grandparents were in their 70s, I think by this time. They drove in a Ford Escort sedan, not the most comfortable vehicle, from Chicago all the way down to right outside Lexington, Kentucky to see me. Spent a couple days. Wanted to see me in commencement. Put on my gown, march with the faculty. So after the morning baccalaureate service, we went out for lunch. And my grandfather was in his cart and we were in ours. We had 2 kids at that time, I think. And we left the restaurant and I got lost and I came out of this neighborhood and I crossed into a 4-lane highway thinking my grandfather would get across like I did. Men are not good people to follow when you're driving. So he pulled in to the highway right behind me, not looking, and a Chevy, I can tell you the color of this van, a Chevy Astro van, T-boned that car. I watched this in the rearview mirror. T-boned that car almost with no braking, 45 to 50 miles an hour. Bam! I looked in the rearview mirror and they're both spinning on the pavement, tires screaming. And my grandparents' car ended up slamming into the curb and flipping over on its side. I'm watching this in the rearview mirror trying to drive. First curb cut I came to, I turned into that thing, jumped out of the car, it always gets me, running down the street, screaming, "Don't go. God, save them. Don't take them now." The car was on its side. The windshield was this spider web of shattered glass, and the windshield wipers were doing this. My grandfather was hanging by his shoulder strap, just staring. I didn't know if he was dead. I was screaming, "Grandpa, can you hear me?" My grandmother had slipped out of her shoulder strap and was under the dash. I didn't even want to look. And I'm screaming, "Are you okay? Don't go." And my grandmother, from the floor of the car, reached up her hands like this. Her fingers laced, and there was blood dripping down her wrists, and she was holding up her hands and just saying, didn't speak, but she was just saying, "I'm okay. I'm going to be okay." She was saying to me, "You be strong." She'd been through this. She came from Eastern Europe. She was in a Nazi labor camp for women and children. She saw atrocities I have no idea of. But she was saying to me, "You be strong." The car is on its side. As I'm standing there, volunteer firefighters were running down the street, and they stood and they held that car. These big, burly Kentucky redneck guys that I put down. I didn't respect them because they're Kentucky, they're country. At that moment, I gained enormous respect for the men of Kentucky and in that city, because they came and they held that car until a tow truck came and put it down on its wheels and used the jaws of life to cut the roof off because they couldn't get the bodies, couldn't get my grandparents out. That spot in the road is an intimate place for me. I can take you right to that spot where the impact happened and where the car ended up. I've driven past there and I've slowed down and just looked, because to me, that's my grandparents' spot. They lived. God gave them about 15 more years. Praise God. But at that moment, God had something to teach me. And he used my grandparents. Wow. Each of us has stories to tell like that. And media somehow figure into it. I wrote a magazine piece about it, and nobody would buy it because it's so schmaltzy. I'm just like, there's all this emotion flowing into it. I'm thinking, who's going to buy this piece? I have to rework this, make it a little more third person. I don't know. I'm working on it. I am going to sell that piece one of these days. Okay, Facebook immortalizes people. And we all know this. Now, there's some rule that when you die, Facebook somehow finds out and you're supposed to take it down, right? Is there some, have you heard about this? How do they know? I don't know. Somehow they find out, and so you can't keep your Facebook for extended lengths of time once you're gone. I'm not sure how that works. But here's one that I found yesterday. Rest in peace, people who died in 2010. And it's loaded. There was another one, rest in peace, beautiful people. There's like three posts. It's like, okay. And Farrah Fawcett is like the main picture. I'm like, forget about it. So, yeah, but this one's great. And people just said, yeah, my uncle, my grandmother, they just list them all. Lots of hits. Okay, Mark Pinsky says that Survivor changed your life. Lost, the series. It is an emotional thing into which we invested ourselves, and it somehow helps us deal with death. I don't know. My daughter, actually my sons too, were so into that they somehow downloaded previous episodes, and like you can get the whole thing, right, online? Yeah, they did that. I'm just saying, it's a TV show. No, Dad. Lost. This is a TV show, let me tell you. So, what Mark Pinsky says is that when characters die in a TV series, it does something to us. I don't know. Another thing that grabs our attention is when characters are wrestling with grief when somebody else dies. What's interesting, based on his theory, is how many TV shows involve death. CSI, right? Name some more shows that deal with death. 6 Feet Under, Bones. What else? Are there more? Law and Order. People die in that one. Yeah. So, yeah. Hill Street Blues. There's all these shows. So, and all of these have plots that deal with the interplay of people dying and death as being part of life. So, okay. Here's what I want you to write today as your takeaway. Speaking of takeaways, while you're doing that, I've got these to give back. They're all graded. I want you to write about this, okay? If you have never taken time to create a written memory of someone who has left this life who was very special to you, I want you to do that in this post, okay? That's one option. The other option, if that's too close, that's too personal, you don't want to deal with that right now, you could also write about the way things you've seen in television, maybe in a film, to you was something that was very personal and helped you wrestle with death and with the departure from this life that's out there, okay? So either get personal, create a memory for someone who's gone, or relate something from a TV show, maybe Lost, maybe a film that you've seen, that just, it was so powerful. You want to write a little bit about that?
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.